The hangar smelled of oil, dust, and something else, something that time itself had left behind. Walter Hayes stood still beneath the flickering ceiling lights, watching the motes of dust float like ghosts through the air. Outside, the evening wind pressed softly against the metal doors, carrying the hum of the nearby base. He hadn't stepped inside a place like this in years, and yet the smell, the silence, the weight of the walls, they all recognized him before any human did. On the table beside him lay a small box. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a silver emblem, the falcon's wings curved in flight, the faint letters F09 etched beneath. His old call sign, Falcon 9. He traced a finger over the metal. It felt colder than he remembered. They had given it back to him earlier that day during the honor ceremony for retired pilots. There had been speeches, flags, and young faces smiling politely, not really knowing who he was. They said words like courage and service. Walter just nodded, thinking of the men whose names never made it to any ceremony. He had always disliked the word hero. It sounded like something printed on a medal to make everyone else feel better. Heroes didn't grow old, didn't stand here decades later trying to remember which hand used to tremble before a mission. He was 74 now, and yet sometimes, on quiet evenings like this, he still heard the rotor blades slicing through humid air, still felt the vibration of adrenaline humming in his bones. He could almost hear it now. It had been the summer of 1969, Vietnam. A jungle valley shaped like a wound carved into the earth. Back then, he'd been 27, and his helicopter was his world, his fortress, his heartbeat. He had a crew of 3. Carter, the calm gunner with a smile like a coin flip, Mitch, who hummed Sinatra before takeoff, and Sergeant Reed, who never spoke unless it mattered. That night, the mission brief had been clear. Extract a recon team pinned under fire north of Dalat. On paper, simple. In reality, suicide. When the first bullets hit the fuselage, Walter realized the recon boys weren't just pinned, they were being hunted. Radio chatter dissolved into static and screams. The valley below was an ocean of darkness dotted by muzzle flashes. And then the order came through the comm. Falcon 9, you're the last bird in range. Everyone else is down or grounded. He remembered the pause before he answered, just long enough to hear his own heartbeat. Then, copy that, coming in low. The descent was madness. Tree branches whipped at the windshield. The smell of burning powder filled the cabin. Someone on the radio yelled, "You're too low!" But that was the point. When he finally saw them, 3 men running through mud, one dragging another, he tilted the chopper so hard the skids nearly clipped the tree line. Tracer rounds tore the air, painting red scars across the night. Reed shouted coordinates. Carter fired back. Mitch prayed. The moment the last man was aboard, he lifted. The tail rotor clipped a branch, sending the helicopter spinning for a half heartbeat, then steady again. He didn't breathe until they cleared the ridge. Later, the report called it an unplanned deviation from protocol. Unofficially, it was suicide avoided by luck and insanity. But to the survivors, it was the night Falcon 9 became legend. When the war ended, legends didn't matter. Paperwork did. He came home with scars no one could see and medals he never displayed. The neighbors called him that quiet mechanic. He fixed engines in a garage outside Raleigh, drank black coffee, listened to the weather on the radio. He never married. He wrote letters to families of the men he couldn't save, and most were never answered. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, he would drive out to an abandoned airstrip and watch the sky until the sun burned through. He didn't miss the danger. He missed belonging to something that made sense. Because peace, he discovered, could be lonelier than war.
The community center used to be a movie theater. The velvet curtains were long gone, but the ceilings still held tiny bulbs, like a cheap imitation of stars. Twice a month, the place filled with veterans who came for job boards, legal help, a nurse who checked blood pressure for free, and a folding table where someone always poured coffee that tasted like memory and cardboard. Walter came for quiet. He knew the times when the lines were shorter, the corners less crowded, the noise less sharp. He had his list. Pharmacies that still honored certain discounts, a clinic that didn't ask too many questions, a flyer for a heater repairman who didn't overcharge retired folks. Survival wasn't heroic. It was administrative. A master of ceremonies in a blazer took the stage, thanked donors, mispronounced a few names, then announced a guest, a young colonel from the nearby base. The room shifted, the way rooms do when a uniform appears. Backs straightened, voices dipped. The colonel spoke well. Smooth cadence, careful words about transition programs and community integration. He was good at this, Walter thought. Too good. At the end, the colonel said he wanted to meet veterans up close, shake hands, ask about their service. He stepped off the stage. A volunteer with a tablet hovered at his shoulder like punctuation. He reached Walter third. The ritual smile, the warm grip, the scripted questions. Unit? Years? Theater? Walter answered plainly. He didn't offer extras. He never had. When the colonel asked for a call sign, something in the old man's posture changed. Not a flinch, just a small alignment, like a compass finding north. He said, "Falcon 9." The room missed a beat. Cups paused midair. A man in the back who'd been fiddling with his knee brace went still. The colonel's face gave nothing away. The volunteer typed. The tablet searched. The colonel moved down the line, but his voice, when he resumed the script, had a thread of static in it. Thin, but there. 3 minutes later, the volunteer returned, eyes different now. He tilted the tablet so the colonel could read the brief entry pulled from an old database that survived 3 software overhauls and 1 budget crisis. The entry was short and ugly and true. The colonel stopped speaking. He walked back to the mic. No flourish, no throat clearing. He said only this: "Sometimes the people we honor are standing in this room and we don't know it until we listen better. Mr. Walter Hayes, Falcon 9. No applause. Not yet. In rooms like this, applause belongs to the living and the dead, not to surprise. Men stood, some because their knees were stubborn and demanded movement, others because standing was the only way they knew to say, "We see you." The master of ceremonies stepped away, hands folded, eyes damp and confused. The colonel didn't tell a story. He read facts. A night extraction north of Dalat. Unfavorable weather. Enemy fire. An unplanned descent below the safe envelope. 12 souls aboard at wheels up, 12 alive at touchdown. Then he stopped. He didn't add adjectives. He didn't say heroic. It wasn't needed. Walter didn't like stages. He preferred doorways where a man could stand without being noticed, but people parted, making a quiet corridor of shoulders and nods. He went up the wooden steps, one at a time, his hand trailing the rail that had been repainted too many times. The colonel's handshake was different now, less firm, more honest. Off stage, in the dim behind the curtain where everything smelled like old wires and dust, the colonel asked for a minute. They stood near two folded metal chairs and a cardboard box full of extension cords, the kind of place where real conversations happen because no one thinks to record them. "I didn't know," the colonel said. "Most don't," Walter replied. Not unkind. The colonel didn't apologize. He didn't promise a ceremony or a plaque. He did something better. "We're starting a mentorship program, not training. The kids have training. Listening, guidance. We need someone who knows how to make hard choices and live with them afterward." Walter said he'd think about it. He always thought first. Decisions made in silence don't shatter when the noise comes back. When he stepped into daylight, the afternoon had cooled. The sky over the strip mall was the color of aircraft primer, a flat, functional gray. He passed a pawn shop and paused at the window. An old pocket watch winked at him, the second hand making small circles of persistence. He considered it the way a man considers small luxuries, and decided no, not today. Back in his motel room, the heater clicked like a metronome with a cigarette cough. He opened a drawer, took out a thin envelope, and unfolded what lived inside. Coordinates, a date, and 4 words scrawled in a hand he recognized as his own, written years ago because he had no other place to put them. Came back later than planned. He held the paper against his thigh and let the day lower its shoulders. That night he slept like men sleep after long winters. Not because he was free, but because someone had finally named the weight he carried.
The next morning, Walter stood outside the base gates for the first time in more than 40 years. The security checkpoint was newer, sharper, humming with electronics he didn't recognize, but the wind smelled the same. Jet fuel and wet asphalt, cut with something metallic and clean. He showed his ID, got a visitor's badge, and walked slowly toward Hangar 14, the one the colonel had mentioned. It was smaller than he remembered, though maybe it was his memory that had grown larger with the years. Inside, a group of young pilots stood in a loose half-circle. Their uniforms were too new, their faces too open. They looked at Walter as if the past had walked in wearing a flannel jacket. The colonel made introductions. No speeches this time, no fanfare. Just, "This is Walter Hayes, call sign Falcon 9. You'll want to hear what he has to say." Walter didn't climb the platform. He leaned against a crate, arms crossed, the way a man leans when he's not sure if what he's about to say still matters. He began with silence, let it settle until the room stopped fidgeting. Then, "Flying isn't about control. It's about forgiveness. The sky forgives less than people do. You learn that fast." They listened, not out of respect for his age, but because his voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already lived through every kind of storm. He told them about the mission, not the medals, not the report, but what it felt like. The smell of burned paint when a bullet hits a fuselage. The sound a man makes when he realizes he's going home after thinking he wouldn't. The silence after you land and count who's still breathing. He didn't glorify it. He didn't dramatize it. He just spoke the truth. And the truth is never boring when it's earned. After the session, one of the cadets lingered. A tall boy, 20-something, with a restless energy that reminded Walter of himself before he knew better. "Sir," the kid said, awkwardly, "my grandfather. He flew in Da Nang. Name was Matthew Rivers." Walter froze for half a breath. Rivers.
The name carried dust and jungle rain. He remembered it. A medic who'd patched him up after a crash landing and later saved half a platoon before disappearing in the chaos of an ambush. He looked at the kid, the same jawline, the same eyes that refused to quit. "Your grandfather was a good man," Walter said quietly. "Better than most." The kid smiled, that naive, grateful smile youth still wears before it learns how heavy legacies can be. When the hangar emptied, Walter stayed. He ran a hand over the cold metal of an old rotor blade propped in the corner, the kind used long before drones and digital cockpits. The metal was pitted and dull, but it hummed faintly when touched, as if remembering. He thought of Reed, Mitch, Carter, of letters never sent, of names whispered into the dark. He wondered how many of these kids would grow old enough to forget how young they once were. That night, back in his motel, he made coffee. Too strong, too bitter. He sat by the window, watching the streetlights smear across the rain-soaked glass. There were moments when he almost reached for the phone, to call the colonel and to say he'd take the job full-time. Then he remembered he'd already said yes without meaning to. That's how these things work. You don't choose to teach again. You just stop refusing to. The next week, he returned. The base smelled of heat and machinery. The colonel gave him a small office, windowless, dusty, but with a chair that didn't creak. He found an old flight manual on the shelf, dated 1971, and laughed under his breath. He started keeping notes, not for lectures, but for himself. The lessons no one writes in manuals. Never trust calm weather. Courage is a habit, not a feeling. Everyone flies alone, even with a full crew. And guilt is the tax you pay for surviving. He pinned the list to the corkboard above the desk. That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the coast. Rain hammered the hangar roof, drowning the world outside. One by one, cadets came in, off-duty, curious, word spreading that the ghost pilot was telling stories again. By the time he looked up, 20 of them sat on crates and toolboxes, waiting. He sighed, smiled faintly, and said, "All right then, let's talk about the day I almost left my heart in the jungle." And for the first time in decades, his voice didn't shake when he said it aloud.
The storm outside rattled the hangar like a distant war remembering itself. Thunder echoed through the beams, a deep, familiar rhythm that made Walter pause mid-story and glance toward the ceiling, as if the past was whispering through the rain. He told them about the night the world tilted sideways. It was October 1971. The extraction had gone well, or as well as chaos ever could. They were headed back toward base when the engine caught a round. The chopper lurched, lost balance, and kissed the tree line harder than intended. He remembered fire. He remembered silence after it. That strange, ringing silence that makes you think you've already died. When he woke, the cockpit was half torn. Mitch was gone, Carter bleeding, Reed yelling through smoke. The jungle hissed, alive, patient, watching. He pulled Carter out with one arm that didn't quite work anymore, and by the time they reached the open field, the sun was burning low, and everything smelled like copper and fear. Reed had sent the distress call, but it was Walter who saw the medic first, a young man sprinting through grass, a red cross patch hanging by a thread. Rivers. He could still see his face, the calmness, the focus, the voice cutting through panic. "Breathe, Lieutenant. You'll hate the pain, which means you're alive." Rivers patched them up and stayed behind to help cover the retreat. When the evac came, Walter saw him for the last time. A white flash in the trees, gunfire lighting his outline, refusing to run. That night the radio confirmed what no one wanted to hear.
Rivers didn't make it, but rumors lived longer than reports. Some said he'd been captured, others that he walked out months later. Walter never knew. He carried that uncertainty like a second heartbeat. Years later, when he was discharged and sent home, he wrote a letter, not to Rivers, but to his family, to tell them who he'd been to them, even if just for a night. The letter came back marked address unknown. So he kept it, folded, unread, sealed with dirt and time. The cadets listened without blinking. The storm had gone quiet, as if even the sky didn't dare interrupt. One of them, the same kid who'd mentioned his grandfather, Rivers's grandson, finally spoke. "Sir, do you still have the letter?" Walter nodded. He didn't move for a while. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same faded envelope, the edges soft with decades. He placed it on the crate between them. "For years," he said softly, "I thought this belonged to the dead. Now I think maybe it belongs to the living." The kid stared at the envelope as if it were a relic. He didn't touch it. Not yet. Some things have to cross their own finish line. That night, Walter drove home in silence. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened like memory. He thought about how the past never really ends, it just changes uniforms. In his motel room, he laid the letter on the table and unfolded another paper, the flyer for the mentorship program. He scribbled something across the bottom, the words uneven but steady. "Count me in until the sky runs out." The next morning, when he walked back into Hangar 14, he didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt like a man finally landing.
2 months later, the base hosted a small ceremony, one of those quiet ones, without cameras or medals, where men gather not to be seen, but to remember. The hangar smelled of oil and polished steel, and someone had laid out coffee in paper cups that steamed like ghosts in the cold morning light. Walter didn't want speeches. He told the colonel, no brass bands, no big words, just the kids and the truth. The colonel smiled and said that was exactly what they needed. The cadets stood in 2 lines, eyes forward, restless but respectful. In front of them, on a folding table, sat the letter, yellowed, fragile, finally at peace. Beside it lay a new one, freshly written, sealed in a clean envelope with careful handwriting. When the colonel spoke, his voice carried low and even. "This isn't about what was lost. It's about what was carried and passed on." He turned to Walter. "Would you like to say something?" Walter hesitated. The room waited. He stepped forward, his boots echoing against the floor, and took a breath that seemed to reach all the way back to 1971. They call it service, like it's a thing that ends. But the truth is, it never does. It just changes the way it asks you to show up. He looked at the cadets, so young, so alive, all trying to hide their nerves behind perfect posture. He continued, "You'll carry your own ghosts, and one day, if you're lucky, you'll learn that ghosts don't haunt you. They guide you. You just have to listen when the sky gets quiet." He nodded toward the young man, Rivers's grandson. The boy stepped forward, trembling slightly, and took the old letter into his hands. He opened it slowly, carefully, like something sacred. Inside was a single page. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "You saved me that night, though I never said it out loud. If you ever find this, know that I carried your courage farther than my own. We never flew again, but we never truly landed either." The boy folded the letter and looked up, eyes wet but steady. "Thank you," he whispered. Walter smiled, a small, tired smile that said more than any ceremony could. He handed the boy the new envelope. "Your turn," he said. "Write one of your own someday." Afterward, as the hangar emptied and the chatter faded, Walter stood alone beneath the high beams. Sunlight spilled through a crack in the roof, catching the dust and turning it gold. He felt the warmth on his hands, the same hands that once clutched controls and fear in equal measure. He thought of Rivers, of Mitch and Carter, of every man who'd ever believed he was done flying. Then he looked out the open door, where a training hopper lifted into the air, smooth, confident, almost quiet. The sound of its blades rolled through the air like a heartbeat. Walter raised 2 fingers in salute. "Fly safe, kids, and don't forget to come back." He turned, slipped his cap back on, and walked toward the sunlight. The wind caught his jacket and filled it just enough to make him look, for one fleeting second, like a man about to take off again.